Picture this. I am standing inside a hut no larger than the shadow of a barn, at the edge of a frozen valley that teaches the lungs to whisper. The wind scratches at the plank walls with the persistence of a stray dog, and every blow carries a hiss of powdered ice that stings like insult. The fire in the hearth does not so much burn as breathe in little panicked sips, a red animal trying not to faint. A woman, shoulders tense with the discipline of endurance, presses a glowing stone to her baby's chest so the child will not turn the terrible color of deep water before sunrise. I can smell singed wool and milk, hear the tiny creak of the cradle, watch the blue of the infant's lips reconsider. Outside, the river is a blade. Inside, the world is one ragged ember learning how to live. I tell you this because I want you to feel the room as I felt it. The throb of heat against the skin and the arithmetic of survival done in real time. On a table gouged by generations of spoons, 4 objects make an altar of necessity: iron pot, bone needle, ash scoop, stone wrapped in cloth. The woman's palms are black with soot, yet the way she holds the stone is tender enough to be prayer. When she lifts it away, a faint steam blooms from the baby's chest and vanishes into the chill. The fire catches a breath it had forgotten it could take. The wind claws again, and the hut answers with a shiver that travels through floor, through cradle, through ribs. Now picture another world entirely, one that pretends the seasons are obedient. Far to the south, a palace sprawls like a tame sunrise, and I am guided barefoot across marble floors that still remember the desert heat even after the sun has withdrawn. Columns rise like patient trees, veins of gold wandering through the stone as if wealth were a plant that could be coaxed from rock with enough confidence. The air smells of myrrh and orange peel. Shadows from latticed windows paint the corridors with geometry, training the light to behave. And there, in the cool echo of a long hall, a queen walks as if distance were a rumor. Her steps are unhurried. Her attendants move like punctuation behind a sentence that does not need to raise its voice. Every door here is a decision. Every surface is a memory of fire. 2 worlds, one ruled by frost, the other by flame. Both are honest about the cost of being alive. The hut teaches you to ration warmth like breath. The palace teaches you to arrange it like law. One cracks, one gleams, but each is a ledger of heat, entries made with ash and incense, with chopped wood and sun-trapped stone. When I press my palm to the hut's wall, it steals from me. When I press my palm to the palace floor, it gives. Both are deliberate, and yet, here's the paradox that hooked me and will not let go: their survival depends on the same secret. Not a spell, not a relic, not even the favor of those moody gods that so often behave like weather. The secret is simpler and more demanding. It is the choreography by which the living borrow warmth without burning the future. In the valley, a coal is buried to sleep through the long night. In the palace, walls are taught to breathe. Heat in the morning, hush at noon, mercy at dusk. Different languages, same grammar. One calls it faith, the other calls it engineering. Both kneel to the physics of kindness. If you listen closely, you can hear the refrain that threads the distance between these places. A mother instructs her child, in through the nose, out through the heart. A queen instructs her court, open in the day, cool by night. The cadence is almost comic in its stubbornness, but it has outlived armies. When the world hardens, people turn to rituals that have never lied to them. The breath is one. Fire, if treated as a partner rather than a pet, is another. Tonight, I'm asking you to travel with me from the ashes of northern villages to the golden dust of forgotten kingdoms. To step across maps that were once soft under barefoot messengers and now sit flat inside books. We will start with rooms small enough to understand and walk slowly toward rooms that think they understand everything. Along the way, we'll meet people who learned to measure loyalty in degrees and who could read the weather inside a person by how the flame behaved when that person entered the room. I won't give you villains. I don't need them. Systems are enough. Incentives, once exposed, explain more than curses ever could. In the valley, Cold reorganizes the soul until sharing becomes arithmetic. In the palace, heat organizes power until etiquette becomes infrastructure. Who benefits? Who suffers? Who decides? Those questions braid themselves around fires, whether they burn in damp huts or under carved domes. They will braid themselves around us, too, if we are brave enough to answer without flinching. The woman in the hut adjusts her grip. The stone dims a shade, then brightens as if it has remembered a story about sunlight. The baby sighs, a small admission that the world can be bearable. The mother's shoulders loosen by the width of a breath. She glances at me, not because I am there, I am not. I am only reading her in the soot of other people's memories. But because every parent glances toward the door at the moment hope makes them superstitious. I want to tell her it will not always be like this. I cannot. Survival is not a promise. It is a habit. The queen in the palace pauses at the threshold of a courtyard pool where the afternoon has been carefully trained to become evening. She steps into shade as if into agreement. A servant, calm and almost invisible, adjusts a shutter so the breeze skims the water and rises, gentled, around her. It looks like magic because we like to call anything that cares for us, magic. But the trick is devotion. Someone learning a place well enough to make it merciful. 2 worlds, 1 lesson. Heat is not a trophy, it is a commons. Mismanage it and it punishes without malice. Tend it and it forgives without keeping score. The line between queen and servant turns out to be a temperature gradient, meaningful, measurable, and solvable if the people on either side agree to share lungs. So here's my invitation. Leave your shoes of certainty by the door. Bring your skepticism. I find it warms quickly if placed near evidence. Bring your fatigue. The past has a way of turning it into patience. We will sit with the people of Valmir as winter forgets its manners. We will walk the corridors of Setham where opulence tries to disguise the labor that sustains it. We will stand in rooms where choices smell like smoke and myrrh. We will keep asking the only question that keeps history honest. Which arrangement of care made survival possible, and how did that arrangement break? If you are ready, breathe with me once before we begin. In through the nose, cold air a teacher, out through the heart, warmth as an offering. The ember in the hearth stares back like a pupil. The marble underfoot holds the day like a promise it intends to keep. On the map between them, a thin road lights up in my mind, bright as a thread pulled from fire. Tonight we travel that road to uncover the secret world of queens and servants, a story of breath and stone, of hands that learned to tame weather without owning it, of women who carried warmth through rooms that did not believe they needed it, of rooms that learned otherwise. If we are careful, we will come back with something practical. Not a myth to admire, but a method to practice when our own sky grows hard and our own machines forget why we built them. The wind scratches again at the hut. The fountain accepts the change of light. Between frost and flame, the world waits for someone to remember how to keep a coal alive until morning. I am ready. Are you? Good evening, traveler. I'm glad you found your way here. Before we move any farther into frost or fire, let's build a room together, small enough to hold, quiet enough to hear. Dim the lights if you can. Let the glow of the screen soften until it looks like a coal that has decided to be patient. If there's a window, leave it open just a finger's width so the air can carry the faintest rumor of weather to your cheek. Breathe with me. In through the nose, out through the heart. It's a strange direction, I know, but the body understands it better than the mind. I'm speaking from a desk that knows my elbows the way old stones know the knees of pilgrims. On the left, a chipped mug that has survived 3 cities and 2 cracked saucers. On the right, a stack of notes that resembles a small, compliant animal. Beneath the window, a radiator ticks like a moth trapped inside a watch. Somewhere beyond the glass, tires hiss over wet pavement and a siren threads the night with a single red stitch. None of this is crucial, and all of it is. History, I've learned, prefers to arrive in ordinary rooms. Maybe you're listening from a single bedroom with the good chair turned toward the quiet corner. Maybe you're in a kitchen where someone you love is sleeping 2 doors away. Maybe you're in a distant city where rain taps the window like a visitor without the courage to knock. Tell me, silently if you like, where you are. I won't hear it with my ears, but the story will. Stories adjust to the rooms that host them. They lower their voices for sleeping apartments. They brighten for night shift kitchens. They settle into the rhythm of train tracks if that's where you are, swaying a little on the periods, bracing on the commas. Let me set the atmosphere the way a careful host sets a table. On it, we'll put 3 things: a measure of quiet, a measure of warmth, and a measure of trust. Quiet is the easiest. It blooms quickly when we stop trying to impress each other. Warmth takes work, but we'll borrow some from the faithful pocket of your devices and from the old trick of noticing our breath. Trust. Well, trust is a slow baking bread, but it rises when facts are kneaded with care, and when the storyteller remembers that people are led by incentives, not morals. I promise you that here. No saints, no monsters. Just systems built by tender, frightened, hopeful hands. Imagine the hum of an old hearth, the scent of smoke and earth. That's where our story starts, not in a palace, not in a war tent, but in a room where warmth meant life and silence meant death. The people there didn't have a word for cozy. They had measurements of survival. Finger widths of kindling, breaths per coal, the distance a spark can fly without betraying a roof. Their songs were practical: stack, stir, shelter, share. Their prayers, when they had breath for them, sounded like instructions to a nervous fire. I move a pencil between my fingers the way they must have turned embers in ash, looking for the line that glows. The past is not distant, it is deep. If you hold your attention like a lantern and lower it slowly, you'll see old rooms flare into view. There, mud walls pressed with fingerprints, a wool curtain with the sturdiness of a vow, a wooden spoon polished by repetition. Heat lives in each object like a second, invisible design. If you wish, whisper in the comments, or only to yourself, where you're listening from. Brussels, 2341. Dhaka, the monsoon arguing with the roof. A village so small, even the map forgets it. You don't know the story, your location, only your company. Still, it comforts me to imagine the small constellation we make. Pockets of light across a planet practicing bedtime in different languages. Warmth, after all, is a social technology. One flame becomes many, not by bragging, but by sharing. The air in our room should feel honest, not too hot with performance, not too cold with detachment. I'll try to keep my sentences like good wood, seasoned, clean burning, free of sap. When I reach for poetry, I'll do it with clean hands. And when I lay down a fact, I'll lay it flat so it doesn't wobble under your attention. If I ever sound certain where no certainty is possible, nudge me. Certainty is a poor insulator. You may be tempted to ask why we're beginning so gently when our night promises frostbite valleys and palace intrigues. It's because gentleness is armor that doesn't look like armor. People weather storms better when their nervous systems have been offered a chair. Calm is not an aesthetic here, it is a tool. The villagers we'll visit knew that. They taught their children to breathe in patterns that steady the hands. The queens we'll meet learned it another way, training stones and shadows to keep their tempers for them. Same principle, different furniture. I'll make a little inventory of sensory anchors for us, the way careful travelers do before crossing difficult ground. Touch. The texture of a blanket edge between thumb and forefinger. Sound. The smallest constant in your room. The fridge's purr, the clock's polite throat clearing, the far traffic's soft parade. Sight. One object that catches light kindly, a leaf's gloss, a book's tired cloth, the curve of a cup. Smell. The trace of rain, tea, dust warmed by electronics. Taste. Nothing necessary, the mouth can rest. In my mind's eye, I swing the door to our shared room wider, and the night steps in like a guest who removes their shoes without being asked. We are ready. Before I guide you to Valmir, I want to speak about attention as if it were tinder. It's the driest thing we carry, and it catches quickly on whatever we offer it to. If we feed it panic, it burns hot and brief. If we feed it patience, it burns low and long. Tonight, we'll choose the slow flame. We will not hurry through the places where people's lives depended on remembering how to stack wood and how to stack loyalty. We will let the smallest details do the heavy lifting. A cold nailhead, an old bruise on a doorframe, a pair of hands that learned the weight of a baby and the weight of a bucket and did not confuse the two. I'll tell the story in first person because accountability prefers to be close to the mouth that speaks it. I was not there, but I carry what the records described and what the physics confirm. When I translate ritual into mechanism, I do it as a kind of respect. When I translate mechanism back into ritual, I do it as a kind of repair. Between those translations runs a thread. Who benefits, who suffers, who decides? I won't tug it so hard that the fabric tears, but I won't pretend it's not there. Now, one more breath for the road. In through the nose, cool air sweeping the corridors of the mind. Out through the heart, warm attention leaving by the easiest door. If you place your palm a small distance from your lips, you will feel it, the old privilege of being warm-blooded. That privilege is older than kings and cleverer than marble. It's what the woman in the hut is spending on her child. It's what the queen spends on her people when she opens the lattice at the right hour. Spent well, it multiplies. Spent selfishly, it turns on the spender. I promise to hold the temperature of this room with care. When the story chills, I'll lend it breath. When it overheats, I'll widen the windows. And at the end, when it is time to bank the coals and turn down the lights, we'll leave an ember tucked under ash, the way sensible ancestors did. Sleeping warmth that doesn't show off, that waits for morning, that knows the difference between resting and quitting. For now, let the world beyond our wall do whatever it insists on doing. Let the inbox grow a little old, the dishes a little patient, the to-do list a little less convinced of its own importance. The frost and the fire have been waiting centuries, they can wait the length of this hour. We will go to Valmir together, where silence had rules and warmth had rituals. We will sit beside a hearth that learned to listen. We will watch a village convert wonder into method without losing its tenderness. And then, when we are properly calibrated, we'll cross the map to a palace that domesticated sunlight and forgot to be humble about it. All right, I'm opening the door to the valley now. The night outside smells like iron, and the stars are rehearsing clarity. Keep your voice low, your heart higher, your breath steady. If fear arrives, offer it a seat. It behaves better when acknowledged. If wonder arrives, don't clap, it startles easily. We are guests in a world that had its rules long before our questions and will keep them after our cleverness has cooled. Ready? Keep the lights low, let the room fall quiet. Keep breathing the old pattern people whispered every time the wind raised its hand. From this small, warm place, we step into theirs. I remember the first time I unfolded the old vellum map of Valmir. The ink had thinned to the color of smoke, and the parchment was soft where fingers had traced it too often, as if time itself had studied the same roads, wondering where they led. The map showed no borders, no grand kingdoms, just a narrow valley tucked between mountains that looked like the shoulders of sleeping gods. A river curved through it, a thin line of silver that must have sounded like glass when the frost came. This was the world before kings carved their names into marble, before history learned to shout. The people of Valmir carved their hope into mud walls instead. They built low, sensible houses, each roof pitched to shrug off snow. When the wind blew, the thatch sang a single, patient note. Life here was not about victory, it was about rhythm. Smoke curling upward through the same hole in the roof every morning. The same paths trodden between fields, the same wooden spoons striking the same iron pots. Repetition was safety. Predictability was mercy. I imagine waking there in the first gray light, the sound of frozen breath against the window, the smell of last night's smoke folded into wool. Outside, the valley glowed with a fragile blue, the color of waiting. You'd hear the soft thump of feet over packed snow, the call of someone checking traps, the answering bark of a half-starved dog. Each sound carried farther in the cold. Even laughter had to be shared carefully, lest it escape and never find its way back. Children played near steaming cauldrons, building little snow temples for their household spirits. Their parents watched without smiling too widely. Joy was always measured, like grain. The elders sat near the hearths, telling stories that were equal parts history and weather report. Every tale began with a kind of bookkeeping. How many winters since the last long frost? How many births since the last burial? How many sacks of barley remained in the communal store? There was comfort in such accounting. It made suffering feel predictable, and therefore survivable. Their gods were not glamorous. They were workmanlike, practical. Elandra, the goddess of warmth, had no jewels, no thunder. She was painted in soot and ochre, palms lifted like flames cupped against wind. Her eyes were said to be gray, neither kind nor cruel, simply watchful. She did not promise reward, only endurance. Her followers offered her the first spark of every morning fire and the last coal of every night, a contract renewed daily in breath and ash. The priests of Elandra were few, and they looked more like laborers than holy men. They tended the communal fires, recited the breath oath. In through the nose, out through the heart. What is taken, return in warmth. I like to think of that as an early form of physics wrapped in faith. For them, divinity was just the discipline of not wasting heat. The social order of Valmir followed the same quiet logic. No titles, no nobles, only work. Families passed their skills along like heirlooms. If your mother carved spoons, you learned to carve. If your father shaped clay, you shaped it too. The villagers measured wealth not in gold, which they had none of, but in firewood stacked under the eaves and neighbors who owed you kindness. The law was simple. If a fire burned in your home, its light belonged to anyone who needed it. A hearth was private, but its heat was public. This wasn't charity, it was calculus. They knew one spark could mean the difference between life and the kind of sleep you don't wake from. And so, they treated warmth as currency, but not one you could hoard. You could borrow it, carry it, share it, even lose it, but never claim it as your own. Their days were dictated by the temperature of things. When the air softened, they worked in the fields, cutting short, green crops that smelled faintly of iron. When the cold returned, they retreated indoors, weaving, mending, singing. Their songs were not written for beauty but for cadence. Melodies that kept hands steady, lungs warm, time marked. If you listened long enough, you could tell the season by the pitch of the voices. The children learned early to read the mood of the sky. A certain sharpness in the wind meant snow. A particular silence meant it would fall heavier than the year before. They didn't fear the cold, they negotiated with it. To live in Valmir was to make treaties with frost and to keep them faithfully. Even their celebrations were cautious. Once a year, when the first thaw came, they gathered at the edge of the river to release small boats of bark and wax. Each carried a coal from the previous winter, still faintly glowing. They believed the river would carry those coals to the mountains, where the spirits of the lost kept a great fire burning for the world. It was a ceremony both humble and profound. The acknowledgement that warmth, like life, must be passed along or it dies in isolation. For a long time, this rhythm held. The valley thrived in its modest way. Food was never abundant, but it was enough. The frost arrived and departed on schedule, like a stern but fair landlord. Even hardship had etiquette. No one expected mercy beyond what they could make themselves. Reading those records now, I'm struck by how much peace there can be in limitation. They didn't dream of abundance, they dreamed of balance. Every resource had its counterpart: wood and ash, breath and smoke, hunger and gratitude. The people of Valmir had, somehow, achieved an equilibrium between what they took and what they gave. It's tempting to romanticize that, to see it as purity. But I remind myself that peace bought by predictability is always fragile. It depends on the world keeping its promises. And one winter, the world forgot. That winter came too soon. The frost fell before the fields were ready, before the harvest had been stored. The first snow did not melt, it stacked itself day after day until doors could no longer open outward. Livestock froze where they stood. The river, which had always taken its time to harden, ceased overnight, silencing its running voice. At first, no one panicked. Valmir had endured worse, or so they believed. They wrapped tighter, burned more sparingly, shared as they always had. The priests reassured them that Elandra would wake with the thaw. But the thaw never came. The sky stayed the color of pewter for weeks. The breath that once carried songs now froze mid-air, falling like dust. I imagine that silence, the kind that isn't peace but exhaustion. The kind that presses against your ribs and waits. That was the sound of Valmir the night before its history cracked open. They thought they understood the rules of the world. Until that night, the rules change. And somewhere in that deep, unbearable stillness, a stranger began to walk toward the valley. I have read dozens of chronicles that begin with famine or plague, and most of them start politely. With a date, a statistic, a phrase like, "The season turned against us." But in the records of Valmir, there is no such ceremony. Just a single, shivering line scratched into charcoal on a birch tablet. The cold forgot its season. That's how the collapse began, not with thunder, but with an error in memory. It was late autumn when the first strange frost came, thin as breath and silent as grief. The villagers woke to find their tools rimmed in ice, their buckets sealed shut. It wasn't unusual for the air to bite early, but this frost had teeth. It didn't melt by noon. It didn't yield to fire. It sat stubbornly on the roofs like a decision already made. At first, they treated it like inconvenience. They cut extra wood, salted what food they could, tightened the walls with clay. Another winter, another test. They had said it so many times the words had no edges left. But this time, the test was not of patience, it was of comprehension. The frost was wrong. It deepened each night but never glittered in the day. Even the snow looked strange, dull, almost metallic, as if it had forgotten how to sparkle. The river froze early, so early that fish were still near the surface, trapped in glass mid-motion, their silver bodies bending like broken reflections. The forges went quiet next, sparks died before they reached the air. Then the food stores began to rot. Frost crept through the granaries, cracking grain as neatly as if a knife had passed through it. The smoke from the chimneys rose thin and gray, then faded altogether. No one noticed at first, it was gradual, like the body forgetting a language it once spoke fluently. You could walk the valley road and see no sign of life but footprints that stopped suddenly in the snow. I imagine the sky during those weeks, a hard, white lid pressing down. The cold wasn't a weather anymore, it was a kind of authority, impersonal and absolute. When survival becomes negotiation, people turn back to what they know best, prayer. They whispered to Elandra in every home, repeating her breath pattern like a mantra, in through the nose, out through the heart. The children mouthed the words even as their lips cracked. Mothers pressed their own warmth into their infants, holding them so close that body and breath blurred. Fathers built fires that lasted only as long as the wood in their arms. Still, the frost kept spreading. There are notes in the Book of Embers describing the first nights of silence. The air no longer carries sound. We shout, but the world refuses echo. Another entry, a week later. One by one, the hearths go dark. Smoke no longer rises. The goddess sleeps. I think about that line often. The goddess sleeps. It's such a human interpretation of disaster. To imagine that divinity has simply dozed off, that the universe's neglect must be temporary. Denial is an ancient technology of survival. And then, when despair had settled like the snow, a stranger appeared. No one saw him arrive. No horse, no sled, no prince leading in. He was simply there, at the edge of the square where the old oak stood, cloaked against the wind, the hood casting his face in shadow. The only thing visible were his eyes, faintly glowing, the color of dying coals. He carried no lantern, only a small pouch that shimmered faintly in the light of the moon. The villagers hesitated. Foreigners didn't come to Valmir, not in that weather. But desperation dulled suspicion. They gathered around him, huddled shapes in the snow. He didn't speak. He simply opened his gloved hand and showed them what he carried. A handful of dust that glowed faintly blue, as if it remembered the sun. Someone laughed, a nervous, hopeless sound. Then, without a word, the stranger knelt before the largest hearth in the square. The fire there had died 3 days earlier, only black ash remained. He scattered the dust into it and breathed once, slow and deliberate. The air changed. I've seen storms roll over mountains, I've watched volcanoes erupt on archival footage, but none of that compares to what the chronicles describe. A single exhale and then light. The ash flared bright as noon, and from it rose a flame the color of a robin's egg, burning steady and pure. It was not wildfire, it was calm, purposeful, almost listening. The people fell to their knees. Children reached out their hands to the warmth, laughing for the first time in months. The stranger stood, brushed the ash from his knees, and left without a word. By dawn, his footprints had already melted into the frost. No one knew who he was. Some said an angel sent by Elandra herself. Others whispered it was death, come to remind them that endings could also give heat. The priests recorded him simply as the Ember Bearer. But what matters isn't who he was, it's what changed after he left. The fire he rekindled did not fade. It burned with that strange blue heart for 3 days and 3 nights, without wood, without wind. On the 4th day, when it finally dimmed, the villagers discovered that the ashes beneath were still warm. They scooped them up carefully, wrapped them in cloth, carried them home. When they cast that ash into their own cold hearths, the flames returned, slower this time, smaller, but alive. It spread like rumor. Every house began to share. People carried tiny bundles of the miracle from neighbor to neighbor, blowing gently until the coals breathed again. The valley, once silent, filled with the murmur of rekindled life. But miracles are never free. Soon, the questions began. Why did some hearths burn brighter than others? Why did some ash cool too quickly? Who decided who would receive the ember first? The villagers formed small circles, each guarding their portion. Cooperation turned cautious. Hope rationed. Still, the fires held. That winter, no one froze. They named it the season of the blue fire, and for the first time in memory, the frost retreated before spring arrived. The river thawed not from sunlight, but from the reflected glow of hundreds of hearths burning through the night. When I close my eyes, I can almost see it. The valley transformed into a constellation of warmth, tiny stars clinging to life against the vast white sky. I wonder if the stranger, wherever he went, looked back and saw that glow spreading across the snow. Maybe that was his purpose, to remind them that warmth is not created, only shared. But a miracle that cannot be explained must eventually be organized. Systems always grow where wonder once lived. In the seasons that followed, Valmir would turn that night into ritual. They would build a whole society around the maintenance of that borrowed flame. They would give it rules, symbols, and hierarchies. They would call themselves the Ashkeepers. And they would forget, as all people do, that the first miracle asked for nothing in return. The cold had forgotten its season. The people, soon enough, would forget their simplicity. For now, though, I hold on to that single moment. The hush before the fire breathed again, the collective gasp of a people realizing that the world had not ended after all. Every age has such a moment, when the impossible happens not to save us, but to teach us what kind of creatures we really are when the frost comes early. When I return to the valley of Valmir in my imagination, it's always the same season, the months after the miracle, when survival hardened into ritual. The blue fire had saved them, yes, but salvation has a half-life. It fades unless maintained. People soon discovered that warmth, like any power, demands management. At first, they treated the miracle as something to revere. They whispered around it, afraid to touch the ash directly. They stored tiny remnants of the blue coals in clay jars, wrapped them in wool, placed them in corners like household gods. Children bowed before them. The priests wrote new verses to Elandra, calling her keeper of breath and ember. But miracles don't stay mystical for long, they become habits. One evening a farmer named Arlen noticed that when he stirred the ashes of the blue fire into ordinary embers, they burned longer. His wife, Mira, the healer who would later become legend, experimented further. She found that if she buried a handful of embers in cold ash before sleep, the fire revived easily at dawn. What had begun as superstition became procedure. Soon the valley formalized the method. Each home was required to save a portion of its night's warmth in an earthen pot. Each morning, families carried a spark to neighbors whose fires had failed. They called these carriers ashkeepers. The title was not grand, but it came with deep trust, the responsibility to circulate life. I've held one of their surviving pots in the museum in Sen. It's no larger than my palm, rough clay blackened from use. Along its rim are etched patterns of breath, short, rhythmic lines that scholars once mistook for decoration. But the pattern repeats a known ratio, inhale to exhale, 2 to 3. A code of respiration turned into art. The villagers taught their children this rhythm as they worked, in through the nose, out through the heart. The chant synchronized motion and breath, keeping pulse steady even as the body labored in the cold. Over time, they began to believe warmth itself was a living spirit. To waste it was sin, to hoard it, sacrilege. When a hearth went dark, the nearest ashkeeper was summoned with ceremony. Neighbors gathered around the cold house, heads bowed. The keeper would kneel by the hearth, open the clay pot, and pour its contents, half ash, half glow, into the dead coals. Then everyone breathed together, following the old pattern, until the first thread of smoke rose. The moment the flame caught, cheers broke out, followed by silence, a silence that felt like respect. I find something profoundly human in that, the instinct to turn physics into compassion. They had no thermometers, no equations, yet they understood energy as a social bond. The heat one person preserved could mean another person's tomorrow. But systems evolve, and evolution always introduces hierarchy. By the 5th year after the Blue Fire, the ashkeepers' duties had expanded. They no longer tended only individual homes, they coordinated the valley's entire heat economy. They tracked wood supplies, monitored the weather, even dictated sleeping schedules to conserve energy. Records mention a circle of embers, a council of 10 families who managed the distribution of ash. They devised tokens, small discs of hardened clay with spiral markings, to allocate how much warmth each household received. To us, it reads like early thermodynamics wrapped in theology. To them, it was justice. The circle's motto was simple: warmth shared is warmth sustained. Every family contributed, every family received. On paper, it worked. But paper, or parchment, in their case, cannot measure the heat of resentment. The first cracks appeared during a mild winter. Some families, those closest to the forest, hoarded extra wood, just in case. The circle reprimanded them, demanding contribution to the communal stores. Punishments ranged from fines to temporary exclusion from the warmth exchange, a phrase that meant what it sounded like. A week without shared embers was a slow sentence. Yet, for all its control, the system kept the valley alive. Birth rates rose again, crops recovered. They built better chimneys, discovered how to line walls with clay and straw for insulation. The valley's architecture itself became a form of worship. Every doorway faced east to capture morning heat. Every home had a central hearth aligned with the rising sun. From my perspective centuries later, it's striking how their practical innovations disguised themselves as devotion. When Mira taught villagers to regulate their breathing while tending fires, to steady their exhale instead of fanning the flame wildly, she framed it as obedience to Elandra. Do not command fire, she told them. Invite it. She couldn't have known she was describing the principles of oxygen flow. Science and superstition danced together, inseparable. Faith provided discipline. Necessity provided data. Together they produced something durable enough to outlive both. But no structure remains neutral for long. As the system solidified, so did power. The circle of embers began recording every transaction. Who gave heat, who received, who failed to reciprocate. A ledger of kindness turned into a bureaucracy of guilt. There are preserved fragments of these logs, columns of names, beside each the symbol for a flame or an empty bowl. Some villagers protested quietly, saying warmth should remain a gift, not a metric. But those voices cooled quickly. Dependence breeds compliance. To defy the circle was to risk the cold. Still, there were moments of grace. During festivals, ashkeepers lit a great communal fire in the square using embers collected from every home. The valley gathered around it, hands outstretched, faces shining with orange light. They sang the ancient chant, breath synchronized across hundreds of lungs. For a few hours, hierarchy melted. The air shimmered with the sound of belonging. I often wonder what that must have felt like, the sensation of seeing your own breath merge with the collective, of knowing that for one night, no one stood outside the circle of heat. Yet even there, the seeds of division smoldered. The circle's power rested on scarcity, and scarcity required fear. When winters softened, they reminded the people that the cold always returns. When fires burned too easily, they warned that abundance dulls faith. A system designed for survival had discovered how to perpetuate itself. And Mira, our healer, our quiet mind of reason, watched it happen. She had built the rituals from love, but they were becoming law. The blue fire that once united them was now currency, taxed and regulated. Still, she believed in balance. She continued to teach the children to breathe softly over the coals, to treat fire as companion, not servant. Centuries later, historians would look back and call Valmir's practice primitive thermodynamics. They would admire how intuition preceded theory, how faith produced science. But standing inside that valley in my thoughts, I feel less admiration than ache. I see how easily care becomes control, how generosity calcifies into obligation. Not villains, systems. Each ember passed hand to hand carried both warmth and warning. Share this, but not too freely. Trust this, but measure it. Give, but count. And yet, I can't condemn them. They were doing what humans always do, trying to design permanence from fragility. The frost had taught them that life without coordination is extinction. So they built coordination into creed, control into ritual. It worked until it didn't. When I close my eyes, I can still hear the rhythm of their breathing as they tended the fires at dusk, a whole village inhaling, exhaling, in perfect harmony. The sound must have been beautiful and slightly terrifying, because that's what survival always is, a choir of the living, singing to keep the silence away. Soon, though, that harmony would tremble. The next generation would inherit not faith, but structure. And structure, once questioned, has only two fates, to reform or to burn. I often think of Mira as the first scientist who didn't know the word existed. Her records survive only as fragments, scratched onto thin birch slats, preserved by chance in the permafrost near the ruins of her hut. But they read like field notes disguised as hymns. Wind turned at dawn, one begins. Ash dry, good omen. Another. Child's breath steadied with warm stone. Spirit of heat obeys pattern. She wasn't documenting miracles, she was building a method. I can see her, if I close my eyes. Hair braided tight to keep it from the flames, hands cracked from cold and soot, sleeves singed at the cuffs. The villagers called her Mira the hearth tamer. They said she could tell when frost would bite by how smoke moved through the rafters. She was no priest, yet the circle of embers deferred to her in all things fire. When she spoke, even the air seemed to hold itself still so her words could travel cleanly. She lived in a hut at the edge of the forest, near the stream that refused to freeze entirely. People came from every corner of the valley seeking her help, burned hands, blackened lungs, fevers that turned the body to ice. Mira had a way of working that unsettled the priests. She didn't pray first. She observed. She listened to breath, counted the pulse, measured the warmth of skin with the back of her wrist. To her, healing was just another form of balance. Too much heat in the body consumed itself, too little and it forgot how to live. It was she who refined the breath pattern into something teachable. I found one of her teaching scrolls in a private collection. Lines of text alternating with circles of soot, each circle smudged by thumb. The instructions are simple. Breathe slow over the coal. Let your chest rise when it brightens. Exhale when it hums. That's the rhythm the people of Valmir used for generations, though they credited Elandra for it, not Mira. She didn't seem to mind. Humility was another of her disciplines. The stories say she once saved an infant with nothing but an oven stone. The child had turned blue, breath shallow as candle smoke. Mira heated a smooth river stone in the fire, wrapped it in wool, and pressed it gently to the baby's chest. In through the nose, out through the heart, she whispered, not to the child, but to herself, as if timing her own hope. The warmth traveled slowly from the stone to the tiny ribs beneath. When the baby's lips pinked again, Mira wept, not from triumph but from relief. The villagers called it a miracle. Mira called it persistence. That baby was her own daughter, Liana. I think of Mira often when I touch the cracked stone displayed behind glass in the Northern Archives. It's blackened, unremarkable, labeled simply, thermal relic, unknown origin. But if you lean close enough, you can still smell faint soot. And for a moment, just a moment, you can almost hear the whisper of breath moving in rhythm, the way she taught it. In through the nose, out through the heart. That was her final gift, not invention, but inheritance. And Liana, though she didn't yet know it, was about to carry that inheritance into the palace of Sethem, where fire had forgotten how to listen. When I read the first southern records that mention her name, I almost missed it. A single line in the annals of Sethem, written in the dry, bureaucratic script of empire. New servant received in the palace quarter, female, northern, pale eyes. Unnamed. She must have looked out of place there, Liana of the Frost Valley, standing among sandstone walls that radiated heat like the inside of an oven. The traders who brought her sold spices, resin, and salt. They probably sold her, too. The clerks of Sethem noted such things without emotion. But to me, every line in those ledgers feels like a hinge. This was how warmth migrated, not as trade, but as testimony carried in the body of a child. Sethem itself was a contradiction made of sunlight. The empire stretched across the desert like a golden scar, a civilization obsessed with balance. Its architects designed cities to breathe, tall, narrow streets that caught shade at noon, pools that cooled the air through quiet evaporation. They didn't worship gods of fire or frost. They worshipped control. When I imagine Liana arriving there, I see her eyes narrowing against the brightness. Everything must have been too loud, too open. The northern forests had taught her that survival hides in stillness. Sethem believed survival required spectacle. The palace, her new home, was an organism made of light. Marble floors veined with gold, archways painted with the geometry of heat. Even the shadows were deliberate, carved to fall at precise angles. She began at the lowest rung, tending lamps in the servants' quarters. It was a job no one else wanted. The lamps, fed by mineral oils, smoked and sputtered, staining the ceilings with soot. Servants cursed them. Liana studied them. She noticed how the flames coughed when air was blocked, how they leaned when footsteps passed, how certain wicks hummed softly before dimming, as if whispering their fatigue. The old rhythm her mother had taught her came back unbidden. In through the nose, out through the heart. She began to breathe with the lamps as she worked, exhaling slowly when the flame faltered. It steadied. The soot lessened. Within weeks, her corridor was the only one that stayed evenly lit through the night. Word reached the queen's steward, then the queen herself. Asheline of Sethem was unlike the queens of later legend. She ruled not through lineage but intellect. The scholars wrote that her mind was a mirror, brilliant, reflective, but cold. She prized precision above sentiment. Her palace was half library, half laboratory. When she heard of the servant who could teach fire to behave, curiosity overruled etiquette. She summoned Liana. The first meeting, according to later accounts, was brief. The queen expected trickery, perhaps a charm. Liana brought only her breath and a small pot of oil. She lit a wick and waited for it to tremble, then breathed once, slow and deliberate. The flame shifted color, from harsh yellow to soft white. Aisling leaned closer. "How?" she asked. Liana answered, "You're standing in the wind." It was the first time anyone in the palace had told the queen she was wrong, and lived. What followed was a quiet partnership disguised as servitude. Liana was assigned to the royal library, where she studied the scrolls of Maris, the lost city of servant queens who, legend claimed, ruled by understanding the equilibrium of heat and shadow. Sethem's priests considered those scrolls dangerous relics. Aisling called them useful curiosities. Liana called them home. Together, they experimented. The queen provided tools, resources, and protection. Liana provided intuition. She mixed the northern ash with southern oils, rediscovering Myra's old formula but refining it. The result was a flame that didn't devour, it listened. It responded to movement, to sound, to breath. They named it breathlight. I've seen its residue in the ruins of Sethem, thin films of crystalline soot that shimmer faintly when touched. Scientists once thought it was a byproduct of incense. Now we suspect it was a protophotonic material, sensitive to vibration. To the people of the time, it was a miracle, a flame that wasted nothing. The palace transformed. Corridors glowed with steady light. Scholars worked through the night without smoke stinging their eyes. The servants, taught by Liana herself, learned the breath pattern to maintain the new lamps. In through the nose, out through the heart. It became a kind of creed. Soon, the whole city followed. Temples adopted breathlight for their rituals. Merchants filled their shops with its gentle glow, claiming it made goods appear more desirable. Even the desert caravans carried small vessels of it to ward off the cold of the dunes. Sethem began to breathe in unison, a civilization calibrated to a servant's rhythm. But while the people saw magic, Aisling saw governance. She issued new laws for energy use, new taxes on oil, new rituals to reinforce the illusion that balance came from the crown. The priests rewrote old hymns, replacing Elandra with the Sun Mother, who taught warmth to obey. Liana watched all this quietly. She never claimed credit for the breathlight. When the scholars asked its origin, she deferred to the queen. "It belongs to whoever tends it," she would say. It was a dangerous answer, because it suggested equality. Still, her influence grew. She designed a new wing of the palace where air and water danced together, a garden cooled by invisible currents, shaded by veils of moisture. The queen called it the Chamber of Tempered Sun. Courtiers came there to debate, to heal, to scheme. They said the air itself encouraged reason. Liana, always unseen in the background, had built the lungs of the empire. I sometimes think of her as the quiet architect of equilibrium, the servant who turned science into empathy, who taught a nation how to breathe. But success in any empire is a kind of prophecy, it foretells its own punishment. As the breathlight spread, so did envy. The priests whispered that Liana's northern ash came from cursed lands, that her breath carried the chill of the dead. They said her gray eyes were proof of possession. The same superstition that had once sanctified her mother's craft began to stalk the daughters. And yet, even under suspicion, her influence persisted. Sethem entered a golden age. Crops flourished in engineered microclimates. Fires burned cleaner. The capital's nights glowed softly, visible for miles. The queen declared this harmony proof of divine favor. History called it the era of still air. Standing there centuries later, among the ruins, I could still feel it. The way the wind shifted as if respecting some ancient design. The stones of the old palace radiated heat long after sunset. It was as if the empire itself still remembered how to breathe. That, to me, is the most haunting part of Liana's legacy. She didn't conquer, she calibrated. She aligned an entire civilization with a single human rhythm and made it believe that was peace. But peace built on precision cannot survive error. The moment one breath faltered, the balance would break. And empires, like fires, do not die quietly. Every archive has its shadows. In Sethem's royal records, the entries from the last years of Ashaline's reign grow sparse, like light dying in a long corridor. Numbers continue, grain, oil, labor quotas, but the commentary vanishes. The scribes had stopped describing the mood of the city. When bureaucrats fall silent, you can be sure the empire is whispering something it doesn't want to remember. I first understood the scale of that silence when I found a single, surviving report in a forgotten drawer of the palace ruins. Written by a servant, not a noble. It begins plainly. The breathlight no longer listens. Those 5 words are the hinge between miracle and decay. Something changed. No one knew exactly when the equilibrium began to falter. The lamps that once breathed softly with the rhythm of the people started to flicker unpredictably. In some quarters they burned too bright, scorching walls. In others they refused to light at all. Scholars blamed impurities in the oil. Priests said the queen had grown prideful, that the Sun Mother had withdrawn her favor. The people blamed one another. Every failing flame became an accusation. And at the center of every whisper stood Liana. For years she had remained invisible, neither queen nor servant, neither myth nor woman. But as the breathlights dimmed, her anonymity curdled into suspicion. The priests called her the Frost-bearer, a foreign spirit who had seduced the queen into reviving forbidden northern rites. They said her breath had corrupted the sacred balance, that she was teaching the city to inhale death. Fear travels faster than flame. I imagine her still working quietly in her workshop, surrounded by jars of oil and ash, refusing to defend herself. She'd learned that argument only feeds superstition. What could she say? That she'd tried to build compassion out of chemistry? That the failure of light was not divine punishment, but entropy? Reason is a poor weapon when the crowd has already chosen its fire. Even Ashaline, her protector, her student, began to waver. The queen was aging, her reign brittle from decades of perfection. To admit error was to invite collapse. And so she sought explanations that flattered her position. She allowed the priests to investigate her friend. Only to reassure the people, she said. But reassurance built on fear is always a betrayal in disguise. The investigation became trial. The trial became theater. I can see it in my mind, because history repeats its stagings with cruel precision. The council chamber filled with incense so thick the air shimmered. The high priest sat in a crescent, their faces painted gold, their hands folded like closed books. The queen sat above them, veiled, eyes downcast. Liana stood alone at the center, barefoot, in a simple linen dress, her gray eyes steady. She carried no scrolls, no relics, only a small clay lamp. The priests accused her of resurrecting the cult of Maris, of breathing life into bones that should have stayed dust. They said she drew power from the dead, that her fire was fed by human ash. The charges were absurd, but in an empire addicted to control, absurdity often masquerades as order. They demanded confession. She said nothing. One priest, younger than the rest, stepped forward and snatched the lamp from her hands. He held it high, declaring that if her light were pure, it would burn clean in the name of the Sun Mother. He struck flint. The flame flared blue, the color of Valmir, of her mother's fire. The chamber gasped. Some called it proof of blasphemy, others, a miracle. The priest dropped the lamp as if it had bitten him. It shattered, scattering sparks across the marble floor. For an instant, the air was full of tiny suns. Then, silence. Liana looked up at the queen. "Do you believe this?" she asked. Ashaline did not answer. The priests declared her guilty of heresy. The sentence, Exile beyond the desert, into the lands where the sun dies. The record ends there, but a later note, written in a different hand, adds, "The queen wept, but the order was signed." There's a kind of cruelty unique to friendship between unequals. Aisling had loved Lyanna's mind but feared her influence. She chose power over loyalty, as rulers often do. I don't condemn her. Systems punish doubt faster than they punish sin. That night, witnesses claimed to see strange light from the queen's chambers, breathlights turning blue, then extinguishing one by one. By morning, Lyanna was gone. Her quarters empty, her tools packed away. Only the faint scent of myrrh and smoke lingered, and on her writing desk, a single sentence carved with the tip of a knife. Fire does not ask who it warms. It's such a simple line, but it reads like rebellion. It dismantles hierarchy in 6 words. If warmth belongs to all, no throne is safe. After her disappearance, the empire's decline was swift. The breathlights burned erratically, consuming oil faster than the refineries could supply. The careful climate balance failed, drought returned. Crops withered in the heat. Riots flared. Aisling retreated into the inner palace, issuing decrees no one obeyed. The priests blamed her, then each other. Within a decade, Sedhem was unrecognizable, a city of cracked marble and half-lit corridors. I've walked through those ruins. The desert has swallowed most of it, but under certain winds you can still hear glass chiming, the sound of ancient lamp shards shifting in the sand. The air there feels different, as if the stones still remember the rhythm they once breathed. Sometimes when I stand in what was once the Queen's Hall, I swear the air moves with the cadence of words spoken centuries ago. In through the nose, out through the heart. Was that her last prayer? Or ours? The scholars call it collapse. I call it clarity. Systems die the way they live, by believing their own myth of permanence. Lyanna's disappearance didn't curse Sedhem. It revealed what had always been true. That balance maintained by fear is just paralysis. The moment she left, the illusion of control dissolved, and the city had to face its own temperature. Some say she wandered back north. Some say she turned to smoke and became part of the breathlight itself. But I prefer to think she walked into the desert night and kept walking until dawn, carrying her mother's cracked stone in one hand and her breath in the other, whispering to herself the only law she ever obeyed. Fire does not ask who it warms. I whisper it too, when the air feels heavy and history starts to rhyme again. It reminds me that every empire, every company, every institution, every person, must choose between owning warmth and sharing it. The former builds monuments, the latter builds continuance. Sedhem chose monuments. They still glitter, buried under dunes, perfect and dead. But somewhere beyond those sands, if you listen at dusk, you can hear a softer sound, a single pair of footsteps, the faint hum of breath. A woman teaching the horizon how to glow without burning. I didn't believe the story until I held the fragment in my own hands. It was small enough to fit in my palm, a thin strip of papyrus, its edges frayed like burnt cloth. The curator at Cairo's National Archives slid it toward me with gloved fingers, her face expressionless in the practiced way of scholars who have seen too many miracles misread as trivia. The tag on its glass case read simply, Fragment 14b, Northern-Southern bilingual text, probable 3rd century BCE. But the moment I looked closer, I felt my breath change. 2 languages ran parallel down the page. One I recognized from Sedhem's royal records, smooth, sweeping script, precise as architecture. The other, smaller and rougher, written in the northern hand of Valmir. Each line mirrored the other exactly. The translation was clear, even after centuries. In through the nose, out through the heart. The warmth you keep is the warmth you owe. And below, faint but legible, Lyanna of Valmir. For a long time I didn't move. The room hummed faintly with the buzz of climate control, the modern version of an empire's breath. Outside, cars swam through Cairo's evening heat, horns echoing like distant arguments. I thought about that girl from the frost, her name surviving not in legend but in the handwriting of two dying civilizations, North and South, fire and ice, both trying to remember the same rhythm. Archaeologists love coincidences. They tidy the impossible into probability. The official papers list the fragment as cultural syncretism, meaning two regions exchanged ideas through trade. But I've read the samples. I've seen the matching curvature of the letters, the deliberate pairing of languages. This wasn't diffusion. It was translation, intimate, precise, purposeful. Someone copied this text with care, intending it to bridge worlds. And that, I think, is the echo that matters. We like to imagine that progress is linear, that we invented balance, sustainability, breathwork, climate control. But standing in that sterile room, I realized how much of our modern world is just repetition with better tools. Our cities hum like Setham's palaces, air systems moderating heat, light sensors adjusting brightness, thermostats learning our preferences like obedient servants. We have built a planet of automated breathlight, and yet we struggle with the same question that haunted Liana's world. Who controls the warmth? In Valmir, warmth was shared. In Setham, it was managed. In our time, it is commodified. Energy, oil, electricity, each priced, rationed, owned. The physics hasn't changed, only the vocabulary. I think of the irony often. We can split atoms, harvest sunlight, command entire networks of temperature and light. Yet we've forgotten the social grammar of heat, the part that understands warmth as relationship, not resource. A few months after viewing the fragment, I visited the northern excavation site where it was found. It lies just outside the old delta, near a dried riverbed that once fed the Mediterranean. The air there is strangely still. The sand smells faintly metallic, like breath caught in stone. Under the archaeologists' tents, rows of unearthed lamps lay in neat lines. Their shapes varied, some northern and crude, others refined and southern, but all bore the same faint spiral etched near the base, the sign of breathlight. When I brushed sand away from one, I felt the rough groove of that spiral against my thumb, and for a moment the desert wind shifted. It sounded almost like someone exhaling. One of the researchers, a woman named Hannah, laughed softly beside me. "You can feel the heat, can't you?" she said. I nodded, though the lamp was cold. What I felt wasn't temperature, it was continuity. The human insistence on keeping the dark negotiable. Back in my hotel that night, I watched the city lights flicker across the Nile. Each window glowed like a modern hearth, air conditioners purring, screens burning blue. We have made our warmth efficient, but not equitable. The same pattern repeats. Those who hoard it, those who beg for it, those who die without it. Setham's priests would recognize us instantly. We are their heirs, our comfort still powered by distance, by someone else's labor. In the archives, I'd also found something else. A digital scan of what appeared to be a second fragment, discovered decades earlier and misfiled under ritual incantations. The handwriting matched Liana's. It read, "The breath that binds the living and the dead is the same. One forgets, the other remembers." I don't know what she meant, but it lingers in me. Maybe she was writing about memory, the way knowledge survives not through monuments but through gestures. A mother warming a stone in her oven. A servant teaching a queen how to breathe. A scholar centuries later tracing their words across glass. The pattern remains. Knowledge passed through care, not conquest. In recent years, climate scientists have begun using a term that feels eerily familiar: thermal justice. It describes how heat and cold distribute unfairly, how poor neighborhoods bake while the rich cool themselves with machinery. Reading those studies feels like listening to Valmir and Setham arguing across time. The poor share warmth, the powerful sell it. The technology evolves, the incentive stays the same. Sometimes, when the heat in my apartment cuts out in winter, I think of Mira burying her embers in ash, of Liana tending her lamps in the palace. I find myself cupping my hands near a candle, breathing the old pattern without meaning to. In through the nose, out through the heart. The air still answers. And in that small act, I feel connected, not just to them, but to everyone who ever refused to let the fire die. The archaeologists labeled the fragment an anomaly. To me, it's a mirror. It shows how stories survive not through belief but through repetition disguised as instinct. Even now, somewhere in a city I'll never see, someone is pressing a heating pad to a child's chest, whispering, "Just breathe." Somewhere else, a power grid hums, keeping millions alive through the night. All of it, our medicine, our machines, our hope, descends from the same principle: warmth as covenant. When I teach this story, I end my lectures with the same words carved into that fragment, because they still hold the only truth that has ever mattered. The warmth you keep is the warmth you owe. And as I leave the museum, stepping from air-conditioned calm into the sweltering street, the contrast feels holy. The night air smells of exhaust and fruit. Vendors light small gas lamps that flicker in time with their laughter. The city breathes, 1,000 lungs, 1,000,000 coals. It isn't perfect balance. It never was. But for a moment, I can feel what Liana must have felt, standing between frost and fire. That fragile interval where warmth is neither owned nor lost, only shared. I'm speaking to you now in the quiet that always follows discovery, the silence that sits between comprehension and grief. The story of Valmir and Sethem has followed us all this way, crossing centuries like a migrating ember, changing its shape but never its purpose. Every time I tell it, I feel the same hush that must have filled Myra's hut before dawn, the same stillness that lingered in the queen's chamber after the breathlight went out. Tonight, that stillness belongs to us. If you're still awake, let the room grow dimmer. Let your eyes rest on the nearest glow, maybe your screen, maybe the lamp, maybe the faint reflection of streetlight against a wall. Think of it not as electricity, but as inheritance. Somewhere deep in the design of that bulb or diode is the same ancient wish. Don't let the dark have the last word. That wish is older than kings, older than gods. When I began tracing the fragments of this story, I thought I was chasing myth. Now I understand I was following instruction. Every civilization leaves behind two blueprints, one for its monuments, another for its warmth. The monuments are easy to find, they survive in stone, in data, in pride. The warmth is harder. It hides in gestures. A mother pressing a heated stone to a child's chest. A servant exhaling gently over a trembling flame. A scholar leaning too close to a relic, whispering a question no one can answer. They are all versions of the same act, human hands teaching matter to remember compassion. When I close my eyes, I see Valmir first. Huts huddled against the wind, snow shining like ground glass, the faint hum of communal breathing. Then I see Sethem. The gold of its marble palaces, the cool geometry of shadow, the queen and her servant standing together over a single light that burns without smoke. The two scenes blur until they are the same image, the north and south folded into one body, exhaling in rhythm. Two worlds, one ruled by frost, the other by fire. Both depending on the same secret. I used to think that secret was technological. The discovery of breathlight, the management of energy. But now, after years of reading, walking ruins, watching my own breath fog against winter glass, I think the secret was smaller, humbler, far more dangerous. Connection. Because once people understand that warmth is mutual, that breath itself can be shared, authority starts to unravel. You cannot rule what refuses to be owned. That's what frightened the priests of Sethem. What confounded the circle of embers, what still terrifies our modern empires of power grids and patents. The warmth you keep is the warmth you owe. It sounds simple. It's anything but. It demands empathy in practice, not just in philosophy. It asks the same of every generation. Will you share the flame, or sell it? I think of Liana's final words carved into her desk, the only epitaph she left behind. Fire does not ask who it warms. She wasn't writing poetry, she was writing policy for the future. The truest form of equality isn't in laws or hierarchies, it's in the temperature we offer one another. As I record these thoughts, the night outside my window has grown deep and soft. A tram passes far below, its windows bright rectangles floating through mist. Somewhere, a neighbor laughs, and the sound travels upward like rising heat. The world still breathes. Despite our exhaustion, despite the headlines that predict every kind of ending, we remain warm-blooded creatures learning, again and again, how to share that privilege. If you could zoom out far enough, you'd see it, the planet glowing faintly in the dark, a single living ember surrounded by void. Not a world of borders or faiths, just a network of warmth moving between bodies, between machines, between memories. The secret world of queens and servants never ended, it expanded until it included us. We are still the ashkeepers. We still trade embers in new forms, data, medicine, stories, love. We still argue about ownership, forget the breath pattern, rediscover it when crisis comes. And maybe that's enough. The fire doesn't need to be perfect, it only needs to be passed on. So as your screen begins to dim, and the rhythm of your breath returns to its own pace, remember what survived. Not the palaces, not the ledgers, not even the names, only the pattern, in through the nose, out through the heart. It's the same rhythm that kept a valley alive, that illuminated an empire, that whispers now through the circuits of your device as it hums in your hand. You are part of that continuum. You are the newest ashkeeper, carrying warmth forward in a world that forgets its seasons. When you close this story, let it stay glowing somewhere inside you, not as myth but as method. And if tonight the air grows cold, and you feel alone in whatever city or room holds you, just breathe. Someone, somewhere, is breathing with you. Fire does not ask who it warms. Keep the lights low, let the screen fade to black. We'll continue soon, in another story, another age, where warmth waits to be remembered again. She grew up among the smells of resin and herbs, learning early that survival was both art and arithmetic. Mira taught her to read the language of wind, the way it hissed when snow was near, the way it sighed when the frost was easing. She taught her to touch fire without fear, to respect it as one respects a living teacher, neither too close nor too far. Liana listened more than she spoke, her gray eyes wide and steady, like pools that never froze. The records mention her rarely, always as a footnote. Myra's girl helps with the tending. Liana fetches water from the stream. But one fragment captures her vividly. Child hums to the fire when alone. Flames respond. I don't know if that was literal or poetic. In Valmir, the line between physics and faith had already blurred beyond recognition. But I like to imagine her voice, thin, high, pure, slipping between the crackle of the embers, coaxing them to listen. Myra's fame grew, though she never sought it. People brought her offerings, dried berries, polished stones, bits of metal scavenged from the old iron fields. She accepted them only to melt down or grind into tools. Her wealth was knowledge, and she spent it freely. But generosity, in any age, threatens those who depend on scarcity for authority. The circle of embers began to distrust her. They feared her influence, her refusal to bless their decrees in Elandra's name. When they forbade independent healing rituals, she ignored them. Warmth is not an institution, she told them, according to one account. It's a conversation, between breath and matter, between me and the cold. And so began the quiet isolation of Mira. People still came to her hut, but less openly. The circle tolerated her only because results cannot be outlawed. The valley still needed her. Even the priests, when their fires faltered, sent envoys under night's cover to beg her for help. I wonder if she ever felt lonely, if she looked out across the snow and wondered whether knowledge was worth its cost. There's an entry, written in a different hand. Perhaps Liana's. Mother watches the flames and forgets to eat. It's easy to picture. A woman consumed by study, the line between devotion and exhaustion blurred until they're indistinguishable. Then came the night that ended her story and began her daughter's. It was the longest night of the year, when even the stars seemed reluctant to shine. The wind had turned cruel, the kind that speaks in the voice of the dead. Mira had been experimenting with a new mixture. Ash from the blue fire, combined with oil pressed from the thaw flowers that grew near the stream. She believed it could produce a steadier heat, one that wouldn't devour its fuel so greedily. In her notes, the formula is meticulous. Measurements by weight, temperature by color. It was her masterpiece, a way to give the valley true control over warmth, not just borrowed survival. But mastery is always one step away from hubris. No one knows exactly what went wrong. Some say the mixture was too rich, others, that a draft caught the flames as she turned away. All we have is testimony written months later. A neighbor, woken by light brighter than dawn, rushing into the snow to see Myra's hut ablaze, the fire burning blue-white, silent, almost beautiful. They found her body near the hearth, arms around her daughter, shielding her. The child survived. The mother didn't. The villagers said Elandra had reclaimed her servant. The circle called it divine correction. I call it tragedy disguised as lesson. Liana was only 7. When the fire died, all that remained of Myra's work were a few half-burned scrolls and a stone, the same one that had once saved the infant's life. It was found cracked but still warm. The child carried it everywhere. After the funeral, if you can call a scattering of ash on snow a funeral, the traders came. Setham merchants from the south, stranded by storm, found the orphan wandering near the road. She was silent, they said, but unafraid. When they offered her food, she looked at them with those gray, winter-born eyes and nodded. They took her with them. Maybe out of pity, maybe because they sensed she was marked by something rare. The records of Valmir end there. No mention of the girl again. Just a note in the priest's ledger. Myra's child gone to the south. The line of the hearth tamer ends. But the line didn't end. It migrated. Every empire inherits its miracles disguised as refugees. Liana would grow up beneath another sun, among people who thought they had nothing to learn from frost. And yet, she carried with her the last spark of a world that believed warmth could be shared but never owned.